Hi, this is PodSafe the UK. I'm Nish Kumar.
And I'm Coco Khan. And I notice you're not wearing a suit today, Nish. Very disrespectful.
Well, I'm on tour in New York as we record, but by the time people listen to and watch this show, I will be in Washington, D.C., and I do not have a suit and tie with me, and I imagine I'll be heckled by J.D. Vance from the audience. Though I would say, given some of the material, I'd be surprised if my clothing choices were the biggest problems he had with the show.
Can you imagine if J.D. Vance came to one of your shows?
I can imagine it, and it ends up with me in a Trump-branded gulag. Well, listen, today we promise is not all going to be about Donald Trump. We're going to be chatting to PoliticJoe's political editor, Ava-Santina Evans, about the government's policies for women. Are they making people's lives better?
And later, I'm talking to feminist thinker Sophie Lewis about how the good name of feminism has been tarnished by some no-good reprobates. It really gets my heckles up, Nish.
Like J.D. Vance looking at a man in a sweatshirt.
All right, everyone, straight to the biggest bombshell of the week. Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky's meeting last Friday was an absolute disaster. Ben and Tommy from Pod Save the World even called it maybe the worst meeting in the Oval Office ever.
And I always think at these junctures it's worth turning to the great modern political thinker Homer Simpson whenever we talk about what's going on in the US right now. So I'd suggest that it is, in fact, the worst meeting in the Oval Office so far.
I'm glad you went with that Homer Simpson quote and not like nuts and gum together at last.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're going to assume that you're all mostly up to date. So as a very, very brief summary, the shared press conference got totally derailed after a journalist implied that Zelenskyy was disrespectful for wearing his trademark army fatigues. And there was an intervention from J.D. Vance that suggested he hadn't been grateful enough. And then that led to Zelenskyy attempting to correct him, presumably in the style of Macron and Starmer earlier that week, which was fine then, but it didn't actually go too well.
No, Trump blew up, called the press conference to an end and sent Zelenskyy packing and triggered a diplomatic frenzy across the pond. Starmer called a conference of European leaders in London and swiftly arranged a state visit for Zelenskyy to meet the king, something that Trump will presumably be very envious of.
So Europe is scrambling to increase their defence spending. Incoming German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has announced a €550 billion plan to borrow for defence. And President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has announced plans to re-arm Europe. Meanwhile, Trump announced a freeze in US military aid to Ukraine.
So as we record on Wednesday afternoon UK time, the latest is that Zelenskyy has issued a letter to Trump, which the president quoted in his address to Congress on Tuesday, saying, "Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts." Trump went on to say that they've been having serious discussions with Russia, and he claimed that he had received strong signals that they are ready for peace. Let's talk a little bit about the UK's place in all of this, because just before the kind of catastrophic Zelenskyy meeting, Starmer had gone to the States, had a meeting with Trump, and the British press certainly was really willing to celebrate it as a win for Starmer. Then the concessions that both Starmer and Macron seemed to have got out of Trump were completely exploded. And it's sort of the problem with dealing with Donald Trump is that he is an incredibly changeable man. And so you might think you have a deal with him and 24 hours later, the whole thing might blow up in your face. But just let's specifically talk about the UK. It's forced us back into the heart of a European conversation this weekend.
Yeah, it really has. There was a really interesting piece in Politico, actually, with the headline that kind of sums it up. And it's Keir Starmer, unlikely leader of the free world. In this very piece, actually, they highlight a thing where Keir Starmer's trademark, he has that trademark delivery of Keir Starmer. We mock it here in the UK, but actually, Trump has said he's got a beautiful accent. And it does appear to be that despite us making fun of him all this time, saying he's absolutely charmless, internationally, globally, that hasn't been the case.
I think if you're stood next to Donald Trump, it's very, very difficult to not look statesmanlike. As long as you speak in complete sentences and say things that can be said to have a discernible relationship with the truth, you already look like a combination of FDR and Mahatma Gandhi. I'm afraid to say Keir Starmer was clearing a low bar this week. But yeah, listen, it is important that we move towards a situation that ends this conflict. I know that there's lots of progressive people who are very rightly coming out and saying we need to find a way to end this conflict. And the only problem within that is that, there are bad actors at the heart of all of this. And we do want an end to conflict, but how do you do that when one of the people involved is Vladimir Putin? Like, I just don't know how you do that.
Last week, I interviewed Sir Ed Davey, and he made a case for why more military spending and ultimately more militarization of Britain is important for defense, is important for peace. But I keep thinking about how, the thing about being anti-war, if you want to call it that, or pro-peace, or whatever language you want to, hippie peacenik like me, is you have to do it when it's hard. When it's really hard is when everyone is saying, no, this is the only way. I don't have the answer, but I really have been heartened when I do see politicians talking about ceasefires and talking about more diplomatic resolutions, because it can feel sometimes that the only options being laid out to us are, you think Donald Trump is right and his deal is great, which is clearly ridiculous. It's a terrible deal and Trump is not great. And Putin not having to do anything at all seems completely absurd and unjust. Or you have to support, militarization of Britain and rearming Europe and all this quite scary stuff. Don't know the answer for that, but those were just some things I was thinking, is there another way? And as progressives, can we be brave enough to say it when we find it?
Well, after the disaster of the White House meeting, questions are being raised as to how compromised the US administration is when it comes to Russia. After Trump announced the withdrawal of military aid to Ukraine, the US has demanded that the UK no longer share any US security information with Ukraine. And the new director of national security, Tulsi Gabbard, once suggested that Putin was provoked into entering the war, prompting tricky questions for government ministers about our intelligence sharing alliance with the United States. Here's the Minister for the Armed Forces, Luke Pollard, being asked about the risks to our national security on Radio 4's Today programme on Monday.
Do we trust that intelligence we give to the United States won't get to the Russians?
Yes, we have a deep and serious relationship, both on intelligence, security and defence matters. This is a daily and continuous relationship. It keeps the UK safe. It keeps America safe from us having this deep relationship.
I understand that government ministers have to come onto these TV programmes and say, we have a deep and meaningful relationship with the United States, blah, 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 blah. I understand that that's what they're saying. But I hope to God in private that is not the tenor of conversation, because if it is, the Labour Party and this government is behaving like a pack of absolute magic bean buying motherfuckers, because you cannot have a relationship based on mutual trust with Donald Trump. It's impossible. No one has managed to do it. None of his wives have managed to do it. Why in the name of God we think we would be able to do it is beyond the pale. And our relationship with the US is no longer something that can be taken for granted. And I do think that there need to be serious questions about intelligence sharing. And I hope to God that those conversations are being had in private. One thing that has really grated on me this week is the number of people from the UK government describing this as a way of helping smaller businesses access investment across the country. Please don't treat us like we're idiots. Don't pretend this was originally part of your plan for growth. You have essentially a bad actor in the White House that has essentially, seemingly on a whim, realigned the entire global world order. You are now scrambling to adjust to that. Don't pretend this is part of your plan for growth. Also, you can't talk about this helping smaller businesses. I'm sorry, but my local corner shop is not going to get a contract to deliver anti-aircraft missiles to Lockheed Martin. I think there are lots of legitimate questions to ask about the wisdom of cutting international aid in the first place. But on top of that, to layer this in as a kind of way of helping the British high street has absolutely blown my mind.
So look, we mentioned earlier that Trump just gave his first joint address to Congress, where he declared himself just getting started. Yay, I don't know. Ugh. Some highlights include a repeat of his threat to annex Greenland and reclaim the Panama Canal. He also boasted about his escalating trade war, and of course, he praised Elon Musk.
If, like me, you listened to the speech and essentially felt like it had been written in wingdings and want to understand vaguely what on earth he was talking about, head over to Pod Save America, where hosts John, Tommy and Dan dissect the speech so you don't have to.
Listen to Pod Save America now, and for ad-free episodes, head to their feed on Apple Podcasts for a free 7-day trial.
In other news, Coco, we are not English.
Well, I think my level of baked bean consumption would beg to differ. What do you mean?
This baked bean test is not passing the muster with Suella Braverman.
Oh, right. Yeah.
There has been this debate that's been chewed, shat out, re-eaten and re-shat out by a fringe whack job section of the right-wing internet that sort of started in a podcast that's hosted by two morons had a conversation with Fraser Nelson about whether or not Rishi Sunak was English or not. And that sort of started a conversation. And as with everything throughout human history, nothing has ever been improved by the arrival of Suella Braverman. Like literally nothing is improved by the arrival of Suella Braverman. So she's now weighed in on this debate. She's written, "I was born here, raised speaking the Queen's English and educated in England, yet I'm not English." She goes on to say, "My heritage with its rich cultural and racial identity is something distinct. I am British Asian and I feel a deep love, gratitude and loyalty to this country, but I cannot claim to be English, nor should I." Braverman's views, it should be noted, have even attracted the condemnation of former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. And look, I think the important thing to say here is, in spite of the fact that we have had a Prime Minister of an ethnic minority background, it shows you we've got a long way to go to bring our conversation around race into the late 20th century. Forget about the 21st century. I would settle for 1986 at this point. It's perfectly possible that your parents could be born somewhere and you could be born in a different place, and you are completely capable of assuming the identity of both places without diluting either of those identities. I can't believe we're still having this conversation. I was born in England. I am English. I have other elements to my ethnic identity because my parents come from a different place. If you are born in London, but your parents were born in Liverpool, there is a chance that you feel strongly that you are both a Londoner, but also have a strong attachment to the city of Liverpool. It is both less and no more complicated than that.
Right, exactly. And we all know why they want to overcomplicate it, because they want to try and legitimize a perspective that is fundamentally, if you have brown skin, you can't be English, right? That's basically it. So then it speaks to all their theories about great replacement and England no longer being for the English, because the idea that there's actually loads of English people that are black and brown doesn't suit that narrative. And it has been a little bit depressing to see that it does feel like every Conservative Party Asian now has to answer this question. I saw Rishi Sunak's answered it. Priti Patel's answered it. Priti Patel is English. Rishi Sunak is English. Suella Braverman, not English. And they're just going to go through every single one. It's, It's not the finest moment, but at least they're doing the issues that don't matter to anyone. That's great, isn't it? They're just in their little vortex of culture war, cutting through to no one. So that's great.
There is a sort of interesting and important conversation to be had within this. It's about the sort of shallowness of representation politics and the idea that you can have a South Asian British Prime Minister. It has not followed that it has automatically raised the tenor of conversation around race in this country. In the 1980s, the Conservative MP Norman Tebbit said that you should test whether South Asians in England supported India or England in cricket. And that was a way of proving national loyalty. And the problem is that, as stupid as that sounds taken in isolation now, that's not a million miles away from the conversation about race that's been happening in Britain this week.
Maybe I'm being glib when I say I don't care. I guess I just mean that, like, it's fluid, it's a spectrum, it's personal in many ways. I don't feel that every politician needs to stand up and say, this is exactly my, it's ridiculous, I feel very English when England's winning in the sports. Obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
When Team GB's doing great, never felt more British. I'm a glory hunter. That's really
exactly. Yeah. The answer to the Tebbit test is and has always been, I support whoever's winning. What are you, a moron? I feel like Bill Murray at the point in Groundhog Day where he's trying to jump off the tower. That's how I feel in terms of this conversation. It's like I'm waking up every day and I've not reached the point of enlightenment. I am nowhere near winning the heart of Andy McDowell in this specific Groundhog Day metaphor about race-based conversations in Britain. Puxatawny Phil.
Puxatawny Phil. Yes. Yeah. Yes. This conversation has got big Puxatawny Phil energy.
Okay, for our lovely listeners, we are actually doing a mailbag special where we look at a bunch of the things that have been sent in. So if you have a question for us, now is the time.
Political questions, very, very welcome. Stupid questions, also very welcome. I know that Nish gets a lot of comments on the YouTube about his luscious hair, and we are all waiting for him to spill the routine. Is it leave-in conditioner, Nish? Is it leave-in conditioner?
I've got curl shampoos. There's a lot to talk about. It's a lot to unpack.
Okay. So send your questions over to psuk@reducelistening.co.uk. Very much looking forward to hearing what you've got for us. And now, after the break, we promise it's not just Donald Trump.
It's not. We're actually going to be speaking to PoliticJoe's amazing political editor, Ava-Santina Evans, about the government's policy moves for women, how our politicians can cut through to a younger audience, and Jordan Peterson.
PodSafe the UK is brought to you by Shopify.
Sometimes when I'm sitting at home, I genuinely have a thought, which is, should I get a side hustle and what would it be? And every time I think about that, I remember Shopify, the all-in-one commerce platform to start, run and grow your business.
Shopify is the commerce platform revolutionizing millions of businesses worldwide.
Whether you're selling stilettos or flaky salt, Shopify simplifies selling online and in person so you can successfully grow your business.
Covering all your sales channels from a shop-front-ready POS system to its all-in-one e-commerce platform, Shopify even gets you selling across social media marketplaces like Facebook, Instagram and TikTok.
Which would be good for someone like me who really has not much of a clue. It's full of the industry-leading tools ready to ignite your growth. Shopify gives you complete control over your business and your brand without learning new skills in design or coding.
And thanks to award-winning help and with an extensive business course library, Shopify is ready to support your success every step of the way.
What's lovely about Shopify is that no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify will be there to empower you with the confidence and control to take your business to the next level.
It's time to get serious about selling and get Shopify today.
This is Possibility powered by Shopify. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/podsafetheuk, all lowercase.
Go to shopify.co.uk/podsafetheuk to take your business to the next level today.
Shopify.co.uk/podsafetheuk.
Now, joining us on PodSafe the UK is Ava-Santina Evans, political editor at PoliticsJoe. Welcome to the pod, Ava.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, Ava, we and our lovely listeners are sick to death of talking about Trump, but we do have to ask you to start off. How badly did the disaster in the Oval Office on Friday, how much did it spoil your weekend on a scale of 1 to 10?
Okay, so I hate questions like this because the reason I'm in this job is because I am a news junkie. And so you have to sort of park the aspect of this, which is like, we're about to change the global world order and this is a geopolitical nightmare. And I enjoyed it purely off of the back of so much news was happening at the same time. The Pope nearly died as well. I noticed you didn't mention that.
That's barely on the undercard of this weekend.
I felt it was in reaction to the Oval Office, but look, I don't know.
I thought it was a particularly extreme piece of Oscar campaigning by the Conclave film team.
Love that.
So, Ava, it's International Women's Day this coming weekend, and we wanted to look at what the government has promised and what it's actually achieved when it comes to women's equality. Rachel Reeves, the first female chancellor in history, promised to close the gender pay gap once and for all and make flexible working the norm. This week, we heard that the UK is getting awarded its lowest ranking for workplace gender in a decade, though. So why are we going backwards? What's happening with, one of the most female-centric parliaments we've ever had, and yet declining standards for women?
So it's funny because there's two stories that are published today. The first one is what you have just laid out, which is that the OECD has ranked us lower in terms of gender pay gap. But there's this other story that the Telegraph have gone really hard on, which is about how, young women are now outperforming young men for the first time in history, and this is catastrophic. And I was trying to think to myself, like, why does this story bother me so much? And I turned towards Jordan Peterson, because he
interesting source.
He normally has the answers.
You could have given me infinite numbers of guesses, and I never would have gone.
I'd be going
the
through
name
all
that's
the,
about to come out of her mouth is Jordan
all
Peterson.
the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. You know what I mean? First, I would have guessed them. But anyway, sorry. Yeah, what did he say?
Well, Andrew Tate was unavailable because he's over in Florida, so I had to go to Jordan. So I was watching this clip where he was asking the question, why do women outperform young men? And his argument was that women are more obedient, and that's why they do better in school, because they're quieter and because they get on with their work a lot better than young boys do. And I think that's a fair argument. But where Jordan Peterson loses me is when he starts talking about how there's actually only a set number of jobs, and now women and men are both competing for those set numbers of jobs. And so he's sort of borderline wandering into grievance politics, and he's trying to make young men angry. And he's trying to say, look, you've now got this entire cohort of women who are taking and stealing your jobs from you. And it's really interesting when you consider that that's the argument that is being, sort of disseminated around social media. That's the one that young boys are viewing, when concurrently we're seeing on paper the gender pay gap has widened. It's gotten worse. It's almost like we're living in this sort of distorted reality where you can convince young boys that they are being hard done by, when the reality is actually it's still not a great place for women to be.
And also, if employers are choosing women over men, okay, well, as is traditional with the right, they always like to look at cultural problems rather than look at the economics of the situation. Like, well, maybe that employer likes underpaying and women get exploited, right? We get paid less. We are less likely to get our promotions despite asking for them. There's all sorts of data around pay transparency and just the issue of women asking for more money and simply not getting it. That you would think that would make you think, okay, let's take working class men, working class women, all get together and take on the bosses. But no, actually, we're going to have a little fight. It's really sad.
But doesn't that speak to what Jordan Peterson was talking about women being more agreeable in the classroom? That means that when they get into the workplace, they are more obedient. And so perhaps they're not pushing for pay rises, and they don't feel that they can use their agency in the way that perhaps a young man might feel that they can. Because there's certainly evidence, if you look at the statistics, that while women may out-earn men when they first graduate from university, by the time they get to the late 20s and their early 30s, that drops off. Men skyrocket, and they continue to skyrocket. And then women start having children, and at that point, that's the point of no return. Unfortunately, we still do live in a country where if a woman takes maternity leave, even though there are checks and balances that are supposed to prevent this scenario, a woman rarely stays on course on the trajectory of her career in the same manner in which a man can.
Whenever we have a conversation about gender equality, a thing that frustrates me is that what is missing is, again, talking about the money situation. Women are more likely to end up in poverty. Women are dealt some of the sort of roughest, bluntest, most brutal cards when it comes to cuts to benefits. If you're a single parent, 45% are living in poverty. 90% of those parents are women. Do you think we can have a conversation about gender equality without redistribution of wealth?
Oh, that was a great question. I loved that. We went real radical there.
Oh, yeah. I like to, start off sweet and then just put the knife in the patriarchy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of the redistribution of wealth. And, one thing that we should definitely talk about is the second shift. And you touched upon that there when you were talking about care responsibilities, and you were talking about women being mothers and perhaps taking up a larger proportion of the share and childcare responsibilities, but also just in terms of laundry. It sounds incredibly trivial, but the second shift is real. A woman, gosh, generalizing, I'm going to get so many hate comments for this. Women do tend to take the heavier burden when it comes to the household tasks, and that is the second shift. And often, well, not often, that is unpaid. I was speaking about that Telegraph article that I brought up earlier, I was looking at who commissioned that research to show that young boys weren't doing as well as young women. And it was the Centre for Social Justice, which is this fantastic think tank. It's their patron is Miriam Cates, who you might remember is a Tory MP who's like a natalist. Like, she's like, we really need to repopulate Britain with British babies, and like, women get out of the workplace and go and have children while she has a job and while she doesn't do any of that. And it was sort of making me think. I was thinking about what she had to say in this article. And it was really brought up again what's going on in America at the moment and the sort of crackdown on women that we're seeing there. You know, we saw the overturning of Roe v. Wade last year, and we're also seeing, you know, the closure of access to sexual health across the United States. And we're always like a few years behind America. So I definitely think it's going to be a debate that we'll have in the next couple of years. And I just sort of wonder, if we keep going on about the pay gap, the women's pay gap, are we going to get to a point where commentators pivot and they start arguing, instead of fighting for higher pay at work, you should actually just be at home having babies?
There's a lot of worrying signs coming down the line. In terms of what the government can and should be doing, one ambitious target that was championed by Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips is to halve violence against women and girls within the next decade. However, the autumn budget has made no specific commitment to funding to tackle these issues. So we often find ourselves in this position, and we're asking this question not in the spirit of frustration, but in the spirit of genuine inquiry. Ava, what's the government actually doing on this?
Well, last week there was the crime and sentencing bill that was introduced into Parliament, that was laid down for its first reading, and it passed. And within that, there is this anti-spiking law, and there's also an expansion on powers to criminalise stalkers, which has been an extraordinary issue. I mean, this was something that Jess Phillips first introduced properly in November, and there are extra powers as of then, but this bill will strengthen those powers for police to crack down on stalking. But that's really one of the sides of the law that has been generally very unfavourable or unfair to women, because the law up until now has essentially been, you can follow a woman around as long as you don't touch her, you can follow her around and you're not going to be done for it. There's absolutely no problem there. But within that bill as well, there's the anti-spiking legislation, which actually would be huge if that passes, because at the moment the onus is on the establishment to protect against spiking. So if you run a pub or a nightclub, then you are required morally to protect your patrons from being spiked. But in terms of legislation, there's actually nothing really there that's concrete. And then I know that you are right to say that there wasn't an allocation extra in the budget specifically for Vogue, but that has been devolved now. So local authorities are actually instructed to fund their areas. So the Mayor of London is very big on this. He has an entire section that's dedicated to violence against women and girls, and that comes out of the GLA funding. So it's more insular. And one of those policies is actually about 999 call handlers. So some of the extra money that has been allocated that wasn't apparent in the autumn budget is for providing a domestic abuse specialist in every 999 call handling room, which means that if someone picks up the phone and it's suspected domestic abuse, the signs might not be entirely clear. There is always someone on hand now who's specialist trained and would be able to identify that very early on. That's a good move forward.
I do worry sometimes that politicians tend to reach for the legislative tool because it's one that they have at their disposal, and I understand that. But, you know, whether they're effective to correct the underlying problems, I don't know. So, for example, spiking, that absolutely should be a crime, and it wasn't before. However, when we think about spiking, there normally is a crime that comes with it, a kind of a physical violence, a sexual violence, something happens with it. And so there has been tools in place to prosecute these perpetrators. We have got laws in place for men that commit sexual violence. But what we don't have is a police system that prosecutes it. And we don't have a judicial system that brings these trials to court quickly, basically adding to loads of distress for the victims. So there's a part of me that is like, okay, yes, I'm glad about these new offensives. But again, I come back to this question about like, okay, but how are you going to fix everything else?
I think you're bang on. I mean, the court system is backed up. I mean, at the moment, if you were to, I don't want to put anyone off from reporting an incident of sexual violence, but at this point in time, because the courts are so backlogged, if you reported today, you might not see trial for at least 2 to 3 years. And the conclusion of that trial, if they go to appeal, may not be completed for, 5 years from today, which is extraordinary. So if you're going to allocate funding, it really should be to clear that backlog.
Hi there, Future Coco here with a small update. Just this morning, the government has actually announced measures to increase the number of court sitting days in the next financial year in an attempt to drive down the court backlog, which has almost doubled in 5 years to 73,105 cases at the end of September last year. Justice Minister Shabana Mahmood says that despite this increase in sitting days, the sad reality is that even sitting to this unprecedented amount, the backlog will still go up. So back to the chat with Ava.
And then there's this whole other component, which I think is more dangerous because you can't really throw money at it, which is it's become almost sexy to be misogynist again online. I mean, if you log on to most social media sites, but particularly onto Twitter, X, sexual violence is probably one of the first few posts that you'll see at the top of your timeline. And you probably haven't even noticed it because you might have been desensitized to seeing it. So you just sort of scroll past it. Tackling the young boys who are seeing that day in, day out, and tackling how they respond to that and whether that drip feeds into their personal lives. I think that's the more difficult issue that we have at hand at the moment.
And that sort of ties everything we've talked about so far together, right? Because you have this kind of very heavily radicalized manosphere, and that links us back to Jordan Peterson, and then at the I guess more palatable end, articles in the Telegraph stoking grievance politics in young men. Like those are not disconnected phenomenon, right? That all of that is part of a continuum of misogyny.
I would absolutely agree with you. And until the government are brave enough to regulate big tech, which I can't imagine is going to be in the next couple of years, until something truly dreadful happens, which is extraordinary to say because we've already seen the murder of 2 members of parliament. And, Jess Phillips is actually, who we just spoke about, the Minister for Safeguarding, has just had someone sent to prison for sending her a vile tirade of abuse over email. Until you regulate big tech and you make them act as responsible social publishers, you're not going to see the end of this.
So, Ava, I'm sorry to bring this up, but I wanted to talk to you about Lawrence Fox. Just for clarity, he is one of our least favourite people. But
he's a mate of mine. I don't know what you're talking about. I'll let him know.
But I guess it's just about... when I heard you talking about just this unleashing of misogyny that is everywhere, it sprang to mind. Just to fill in our listeners in case they haven't caught it, back in September 2023, you became his focus. He unleashed a stream of, I think it's fair to say, hatred toward you live on GB News. It ultimately led to his firing. Ofcom ruled that the incident was clearly and unambiguously misogynistic. But, from your perspective, and you are at a really good vantage point for this because presumably all that hatred you talk about on X, you have experienced it. What are we seeing at the minute? Are we seeing an uptick? Is this still going up and up? Is this getting worse? Or was that time in 2023 a particularly unique time for misogyny against women, particularly women in the public sphere?
I think, by the way, if you're listening to this and not watching, if you'd like to go and check whether you think I am shaggable or not, and then let me know, that's great. Inbox is open.
Do that. Do not.
I'm ready to.
No.
Feel free to correct him.
If any of our listeners do that, I don't know, I have no lever to pull, but know that I will be disappointed.
Coco Khan will come around your house and beat you up.
Yes.
She says she has no levers to pull. She has levers to pull.
She has levers. I've got slippers, I'll throw them. I've got good aim. Don't do it.
I think, on that, I find it so embarrassing. I have to joke about it because it's just so, I don't know, it's really odd being at the centre of a story when I'm normally the one bitching about other people. Yeah. Like being the one bitched about, it's just like, it's very, very odd. And it's sort of like, on a larger scale, Jess Phillips I can't get her name out of my mouth, honestly. Let's just make this the Jess Phillips podcast. Earlier this year, Elon Musk launched this vile tirade on her, suggesting that she was he called her a rape genocidal apologist. And the outpouring of heinous messages that were directed at Jess Phillips, threats, I mean, real threats that were directed on the platform X that was stirred up by this man who owns a social media company. At that point in time, that's when the government should have been checking itself and saying, is this something that we can allow to continue for much longer? My incident was very different because it happened on a national broadcaster. I mean, it happened on something that is regulated and where you know that is not palatable and you're not allowed to do those things within the parameters of the law. The more worrying thing for me is what happens on social media. And I think, I pretty much, Coco, you must have this all the time. Like, I just turn off my replies like constantly.
Oh, yeah.
And so I have no idea what they're saying about me unless my sister tells me about it.
But is this level of misogyny, is it new? Do you feel like it's new?
I don't think it's new, but I certainly think the volume is new. I think that in about 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, you perhaps wouldn't have been able to find someone who agrees with you or supported your argument. You'd just be sort of sitting in your bedroom thinking, oh my God, I hate that woman. I hope she dies. But you wouldn't have someone on social media liking your comment to validate you. And I think that that's perhaps contributing to the increase. But then there's also this other side of it. And I don't want to sound too earnest, but I do think that I'm going to sound incredibly honest. We've had 14 years of austerity. We had a financial crash in 2008 that we never really recovered from. Wages have stagnated during that time. Job prospects have decreased. And I do think that contributes to the way that people interact with each other. And I do think that has created a very febrile atmosphere and a very febrile society where we're sort of naturally angry and on edge, and you're sort of looking for a pressure point or for a splinter to set you off. And unfortunately, sometimes that is the woman who is on Twitter.
Before we go over, I just want to ask you specifically about PoliticsJoe. And it's an outfit that's experienced huge growth in the last few years. And also its audience skews younger than a lot of media organizations. And that feels like quite an important audience to be reaching at the moment, because, again, the kind of current running through all of this is that we have these bad actors in mainstream political parties and mainstream elements of the kind of regulated media. And then on top of that, we have the kind of misogyny being stoked by unregulated tech platforms. So those two organizations are working essentially in Congress with each other to stoke grievance politics, specifically in the area of young men. As a media outfit that is reaching a younger audience, how can political parties and campaign groups that are trying to essentially de-radicalize young men actually access that audience?
I think you meet them where they are, which is something that a lot of political strategists don't tend to do. They sort of, I do think it's really as basic as young men are on Reddit and they're on other social media platforms. And so you take your content to them. You don't expect them to find you. And this is, to be quite frank, I've spoken to many advisors over my time. And my argument to them has always been, well, why on earth are you taking a story to the Telegraph that's about new housing that you're about to build? Put that on social media where they are so they can see it. Because I do think that a lot of this is very, very simple. When you've got poor economic prospects, I do think you start looking around for someone who can validate you, not only as a person, but possibly as a man, who might be there to tell you it's not your fault, don't worry about it. And that's how you end up in these echo chambers and in sort of, enclaves. So I do think, if Labour are going to be successful over this parliament, they have to start targeting their policies at younger people.
Yeah, and it's not enough just to say, I'm brat. That's not enough. How stupid do you think we are?
Yeah.
You can't just go around saying I'm brat and expect a vote anyway.
Or saying that I'm LGBT friendly. I mean, just saying that in principle doesn't then make all young people go, well, you got my vote then. It has to be, you have to be in practice. You have to put policies into practice for young people to buy into them.
Ava-Santina Evans, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK. And if you'd like to hear more from Ava, you can catch her on the PoliticsJoe podcast.
After the break, I'll be speaking to feminist thinker Sophie Lewis about why feminism has become so divisive and how we can reclaim it. Pod Save the UK is brought to you by Sky Sports.
What are you most excited about in F1 this season, Coco?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Nish, because I do feel very close to this story. My other half is what I would describe as a Lewis Hamilton stan. And he's moving to Ferrari. It's an enormous deal. And for the fans, the emotion, you can feel it. They are really, really excited about this season. It's going to be a big one.
Absolutely it is. After over a decade with Mercedes, Lewis Hamilton has taken on the biggest challenge of his career, driving for the most legendary team in F1 history. Can he bring Ferrari back to the top, or will the pressure of the prancing horse prove too much?
Right, okay, because Lewis Hamilton, he represents the new school of F1. He's young, he's vibey, he's cool. And then there's Ferrari, which are old school. As you can see, I hear a lot about this at home. So from Monaco's tight corners to the high-speed chaos of Silverstone, every race is a battle, not just against the clock, but against the competition, the strategy, the nerves. And with Sky Sports F1, you're not just watching, you're inside the action live. So don't miss a single moment.
Search Get Sky Sports F1 for details. Go to sky.com/TV/sports to upgrade to Sky Sports F1. That's sky.com/TV/sports to upgrade to Sky Sports F1.
So love it or loathe it, it's International Women's Day this weekend. I've always had a soft spot for the, what are we calling it, event, public holiday, a commemoration of all the things that women have done throughout history. But then again, since I've been 16 years old, can you believe it? I've been calling myself a feminist. And it's been interesting to be calling yourself that for so many years. I've seen how different groups have interpreted this term. You know, when I was at university, I think people just used it as shorthand for dresses quite frumpy. But then there was this emerging 2016 moment where it felt like feminism had gone mainstream. But now today, I see some challenging statistics. Only 1 in 5 young women would call themselves a feminist. You've got figures like Kemi Badenoch. She calls herself a feminist, but then she also labels maternity pay excessive. What does it even mean to be a feminist anymore? And is this a term that we need to fight for? So joining me today to discuss this true heart of feminism and how we can reclaim it is Sophie Lewis. Her new book, Enemy Feminisms, TERFs, Police Women and Girl Bosses Against Liberation, looks at why some forms of feminism have diverged so fundamentally from others as to become what she calls enemies, and opens up new possibilities for what feminism could be. Sophie, welcome to Pod Save the UK.
Thanks for having me, Coco.
So how do you feel about International Women's Day?
I'm pretty romantic about it. I'm like, yeah, International Working Women's Day. I'm kind of into it.
Because I only learned this myself recently that, you know, as you put it there, International Workers' Women's Day, it's from the Soviet Union, right? I think it was under Lenin that they created this day. They landed on this day to celebrate the role of the women in the Russian Revolution, which sounds much more taking up arms than possibly buying a new makeup palette.
Well, yes. And, you know, I am pretty committed to the idea, as they used to say in the 70s among Marxist feminists, that every woman is a working woman.
I just want to return to my makeup palette thing because I feel very guilty that I've said this as a high consumer of makeup palettes. I suppose really what I mean is about the consumerism element of it. It seems that feminism now is about buying products that empower you rather than improving your social conditions. And of course, as part of that, being able to express yourself and express your bodily autonomy. Does that sound less like I'm going to get cancelled now?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree.
Good. I just want to check. It's important to me. So, Sophie, part of the difficulty of defining feminism is because it means different things at different moments in history. I guess what I wanted to ask you, and I know this is such a big question, but like, if you had to give a potted history of the different feminist waves in the UK, could you do it in, say, 90 seconds?
Well, I think the things that will really raise eyebrows about my history, which is 200 years worth of ways in which feminists, self-described very much in the history books as suffragists, that's the first wave, I suppose, as bona fide women's liberationists, if you're going to talk about the second wave. They've been more dedicated to things like racism, even fascism, than we have hitherto really acknowledged. There's been a big conversation about white feminism, and that's been really, really generative, I think, in many ways. But I think there's something almost more that needs to be said, because the way that we tend to understand the times when women's rights activism appeared to be a form of white supremacism is that we say that the feminists were in bed with or seduced by or weaponized by or confused into or instrumentalized by or used by the real baddies, or they were just of their time and they made some mistakes. And then we can still keep feminism as a word that means good politics, that just means good. Which is how I was. You said you were a feminist since 16. I don't know. I'm not trying to one-up you. I think I was a feminist since I was 4.
Yeah, well, I was one in the womb. Yeah, I'm joking. I might have been. I have no clue.
It's so funny because
taking up space, Sophie. Actually, I think you'll find
the anti-abortion self-described feminists in the US have a sign that says "feminist from conception." So the joke you just made.
Oh, right. I was thinking more just like physically, I'm in someone's womb. I guess that's feminist in a way, isn't it? Because taking up the space.
Oh, quite right.
I interrupted you about your being a feminist from 4. Please tell me more.
No, I mean, in a way, I wanted to sit down and write this book because I wanted to work something out. I was not particularly satisfied with the way that all of my friends and I tend to look at the things that get done and get called feminism today, whether it's discourses and policies about hijabs and Islam or discourses and policies about trans women. And when we say that's not feminism, I get why we do. That approach has merits. Prominent British commentators are out there quite often saying there's no such thing as right-wing feminism, which is quite ironic because I really understand much of the anti-trans, sex-based rights, as they call it, quote unquote, activism to be profoundly right-wing in a way. I think I've got receipts to show over 200 years. But what I wanted to do was reinvigorate a way of belonging to feminism that understands that feminism is such a capacious thing because gender itself is such a confused concept. The concept of woman has never been unified, has never been non-contradictory. So the ways that people build on top of it to say, let's liberate this thing, gender, is going to be capable of being so contradictory as well that they're actually not just problematic differences, they're enemies. You can build things on top of the idea of gender inequality that are so radically different that they're actually opponents of one another based on history. Unless you're telling me we're going to say, Susan B. Anthony, not a real feminist, Millicent Fawcett, not a real feminist. We could do that if you want. We could do that.
Not a very fun game. It seems like at the end of it there'll be no feminists left.
Yeah, exactly. We could go that route, but then we wouldn't really have anyone left because you know what? Feminism, like everything else in history, was formed, in the crucible of other historic forces like imperialism, like white supremacy, like capital accumulation, and it's classed and it's bourgeois and it's race. Of course, it's going to be marked by these things. At the same time, there's always the other people who we don't tend to remember in that way, doing feminism in a way that is for everybody, in a way that is about sharing the resources of life making and finding ways to take back control from bosses, patriarchs, and communize care.
Well, look, we know for sure that reproductive rights has definitely been an issue that has been of great concern to feminists for a very, very long time. So at the start of this year, we had President Trump becoming president again. Of course, famously, he overturned Roe v. Wade in the States, plunging a lot of American women into a terrifying system where they're not sure they'll be able to access reproductive care. It's been quite terrifying. There was also, in this presidential term, an executive order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. And yet sometimes I hear that people say that Donald Trump is a feminist because he is defending women. I just wondered if you could explain, what is that thinking and is it feminist?
Yeah, so this is exactly the kind of problem that leads one to go and sit down and read a lot of books to say, can we exclude those people doing feminism in ways that seem pretty fascist to us from the category feminism, which would feel much nicer. Yeah, I mean, it's surprising, isn't it, Coco? Like the number of high-profile British feminist commentators who applauded the Trump executive order defending women against gender ideology extremism as a win for women's rights. You know, J.K. Rowling was tweeting approvingly about the executive order, and then a whole host of others as well. And it was actually in Trump's first term that his daughter Ivanka called him a feminist. The self-described radical feminists applauding the anti-trans politics mushrooming in the United States and around the world. If you ask me, you can't take this strand of politics out of feminism without losing all coherence. What I'm interested in is not so much, though, whether you think these actors are quote unquote real feminists. What I care about, though, is whether people thinking they are real feminists stops them from fighting them in the full-throated way that one has to actually confront fascisms. It sounds very provocative, but I think when you see how British feminist ideas, frameworks, policy, language, and moral alibis have given the right wing, you know, its juice, its power, it's very hard to say that these British feminists don't have any responsibility. As we just started this little, you know, part of the conversation by noting, many of them are quite happy to acknowledge that, right? They see their goals as completely aligned with MAGA, with Trump on this particular issue, and they see the left as having deserted women's rights, leaving feminism as a thing open for the right to sort of pick up and do.
So am I right in thinking that essentially you're suggesting that it's the anti-trans feminism in the UK that is leading the charge for anti-trans feeling? I mean, I think so often in the UK we think about a lot of our politics being influenced by America, but actually on this occasion you're saying it's kind of the other way around, that it's the voices here in the UK that have reinvigorated what or certainly breathed new life into an idea that perhaps in the States was not really picking up much steam and now is.
I'm careful to say that I think the language, the frameworks have been crucial in the mushrooming of anti-trans politics. I'm not saying leading the charge. There's also something about the whole book that I think it's important there to note that the objection one might reasonably have is, okay, Sophie, why are you talking about the role of feminists and feminisms in all of these violent projects of domination? Why single out feminists' co-responsibility? And to that, I say, yeah, I mean, it's a valid sort of concern because, you know, it's actually genuinely true that women get monstered disproportionately, you know, and we need to be really careful about this. At the same time, women are not part of history. When I explained in the New York Times in 2019 why British feminism became anti-trans or how it became anti-trans, there were some British pundits, some TERFs, if you want to call them that, self-described gender critical women who tweeted at me, newsflash, women were not really involved in that whole empire thing, right? And that's just, you know, not true. It's just not true at all. I think I would not say that feminists have led the charge when it comes to things like anti-trans panic today, but nor would I say they have not had a crucial role, right? And if we understand that feminism is not a domain of purity, I think we can get actually more comfortable claiming ourselves as, you know, liberatory, critically utopian feminists today. And that's what I see actually all around me. You know, people are looking after one another, distributing DIY hormones, you know, doing prison and migrant solidarity work. And that's feminism. They just don't see themselves in it.
I kind of agree. You know, I'm a woman of color myself. I grew up in a Muslim family. You know, I've always felt really sad when like cousins of mine have been like, oh, feminism, that's for Westerners, isn't it? And I just think, no, that it's not. It's for everyone. It's for every culture around the entire world. Yes, there has been a strain of feminism which likes to finger wag at women from different communities, basically patronize them and say that their relatives who are male that they love are just barbarians, and so that sort of drives them away from it. But I agree that, like, you know, there is something for everyone. It's utopian. I'm glad you used that word. And it's not also about hating men, but hating patriarchy and unfairness and things like that. So, you know, I'm glad we had this chat because it makes me feel revived in my pride of being a feminist, but I am aware that it does feel like a bit of a dirty word now. Do you think the term feminist is still useful politically, or do we need to let it go and get a new word, for example?
Yeah, I do have interest in all the different ways that people have found a word that suits them, because many people have not been happy and they've not thrived in the house of feminism. You just mentioned your Muslim background. You know, plenty of trans women have also not felt good in that house, as I've just described it, you know, and there are different geographies and, you know, cultural backgrounds that lead people to take up different words like womanist. Some people just prefer women's liberationist. And then there's this word that the trans philosopher Jules Gill Peterson gives us at the end of her book, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, which is mulheríssima, which is this Brazilian street queen theorized term that means the most woman. And it's about leaning into the excess and the joy and the mostness and the extraness of being woman, even though you can't afford to be all of the time. And that's something that's actually really expansive and that allows everyone to really, you know, stop with the purifying and the fantasy that, you know, some of us are whores and some of us are good girls and some of us are sort of, you know, betraying something dignified about respectable womanhood by putting makeup on where we started and just really sort of take up a practice of gender abundance.
That's such a beautiful final image. Sophie Lewis, thank you for joining us on Pod Save the UK. Sophie's book, Enemy Feminisms, TERFs, Police Women and Girl Bosses Against Liberation, is available now.
And that's it. Thanks for listening to Pod Save the UK. And a quick reminder that we want your questions. If you've got a burning question for Coco or me, drop us a line at psuk@reducedlistening.co.uk. We're going to be pulling out these in a couple of weeks for a mailbag special.
Also, don't forget to follow at Pod Save the UK on Instagram, TikTok and Twitter. We're also on Blue Sky now, so follow us at podsavetheuk.crooked.com. And if you want more of us, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Pod Save the UK is a reduced listing production for Crooked Media.
Thanks to senior producer James Tyndale and assistant producer May Robson.
Our theme music is by Vasilis Fotopoulos.
The executive producers are Anishka Sharma, Madeline Herringer and Katie Long, with additional support from Ari Schwartz.
And remember to hit subscribe for new shows on Thursdays on Amazon, Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts.